December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, 0430 hours. Rain spits on hot steel. Floodlights stab across a road that only yesterday was calm water. The harbor still smells of burning paint and bunker oil. It clings to the tongue like old pennies. A launch shoulders through slicks of iridescence toward Battleship Row. And in the bow stands Captain Homer N. Wallen. Cap pulled low, jaw set the way it gets when a man knows the work will be filthy and the clock unfair. The launch noses against a mangled barge. "All right," he says, voice pitched to cut the diesel's thrum. We start counting. We start lifting. We start living with the mud. Men nod. Navy divers in canvas suits, ship fitters in oilskins, civilian riggers pulled in the night from the piers. He steps onto a ladder that was never made for officers and climbs into the dark belly of a job the size of a fleet. The Oklahoma has turned turtle, a capsized mountain, and Arizona is a tomb. Their fates are already sketched by the dead weight of armor and the physics of fire. But between those certainties lie California, West Virginia, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Some settled to the bottom with decks awash, some beached, some burned, all fouled with holes punched by torpedoes and shell. Wallen walks the shattered quay with a notebook and a stingy nod for anything that still answers to power. His salvage crews don't wait for speeches. They chalk hole maps along hulls. They string air hoses and telephone lines. They tug at tangles of 8-inch mooring hawsers that look like slain snakes. A diver in a copper hat ducks his head and vanishes into black water, the temperature of grief. The plan that forms before the sun has two verbs: seal and pump. For ships that sank upright in the shallow harbor, they will build cofferdams, bolt on wooden and steel collars that give the hulls temporary freeboard, letting pumps work faster than the sea can seep in. For ships with torn sides, they will patch. Divers feeling along ruptures by braille, driving oak wedges, lowering curved Navy Standard patches against the skin, dogged tight with chains and stanchions from the outside, then caulked from within when the water falls. Each patch is a small geometry problem executed in zero visibility by hands, lungs, and nerve. No one is coming to raise these ships for us, Wallen tells a petty officer who has the habit of smiling at trouble. We are the ones. In Washington, some will doubt. In Tokyo, some will assume these hulks are finished for the war. But on this quay, the argument is already turning into a schedule. By mid-morning, he is aboard USS California long enough to learn how she died. Watertight doors dogged, pumps running, crew fighting, then a power failure and a slow settling that trapped air, oil, and men below. West Virginia is worse to look at. Torpedo holes torn below the armor belt, decks heaved by internal blasts. But she sits upright, a salvager's gift. Nevada, beached after her brave dash for the channel, is smoke-stained, scarred, and stubbornly alive. Wallen circles them, writing numbers. Whole lengths, frame stations, temporary power loads, pump capacities. Capacity times head equals lift, a diver's rhythm. He does not write the other numbers that everyone carries. Bodies found, compartments open to silence. The days they will need to work in respirators because hydrogen sulfide breeds in warm sludge and will drop a man like a sap if he blinks. He leaves that to the surgeons and the chaplains. He is here for salvage, which is just another word for refusing to quit. As shore, a floating crane, its boom twisted by blast, gets a new sheave from a machine shop that still smells of peacetime. Yard craft line up like ants with welders' transformers, power cables, lengths of plate. Dry dock number 2 drains and fills twice, while yard gangs make it ready for the first ship that can be floated enough to limp inside for blister work and shaft inspection. A chief boatswain's mate in charge of divers writes the names of his men in chalk on a blackboard. In water, up, rest. and underlines the rotation with a knuckle. Above them, a signal lamp blinks the old language across a harbor that learned a new one yesterday. Inside West Virginia, when they first lower the pumps, the hoses sneeze sludge the color of split coffee. With the water level down a few feet, you can hear the living ship again. The small creaks at the frame joints, the tick of a cooling pipe, a cheerful drip where a dogged hatch weeps like a stubborn child. A machinist's mate pops an access plate, and the compartment exhales a breath that sends a dozen men backward. A hospitalman's ampule revives one who didn't step fast enough. "We'll need blowers here," a lieutenant says, voice flat, writing it down instead of swearing. And always the divers. 6 minutes of light work, 12 of hard, feeling for rips too jagged for hands, painting a mental picture in the dark that they will draw later in pencil, wet paper, and grease. They joke in the way working sailors always have, about sharks made of oil and a harbor octopus that hoards spanners. But their eyes are ringed when the helmets come off. At noon, Wallen pushes a cold sandwich into his pocket and walks to Nevada. He runs a palm over her battered flank the way a veterinarian checks a great horse. The torpedo scars are ugly, but the plates around them still talk like steel when you tap them, a good sign. He stops at a chalked patch template and nods. "We float her," he says, simple as weather. Temporary repairs, then to the States for rebuilding. The men around him glance at one another, a spark under a wet blanket. Orders like that are not words. They are promises. And the first test of the promise will come when the patch teams beat back the sea, the pumps get a little ahead of death, and Nevada rises from red mud to green water. That will tell the yard that the game is not only possible, it's happening. By sunset, the harbor has a new heartbeat. From supply shacks come cofferdam frames, curving timbers and steel plate that will bolt to hull edges like dentures, ugly and perfect. From the shops come dog bolts by the bucket and rubberized canvas cut to patterns made of tape and chalk on wet steel. From the quay come stories that will only be told later. Of a diver who found a hand on a ladder and held it a long moment before prying his own away. Of a bosun who cursed a pump until it chose to live. Of a radio man who walked the quay pausing, listening, sure he could still hear yesterday's code in the clatter of today's tools. "Don't stop to admire your work," Wallen tells a young officer who does not yet know he is brave. "We'll admire later." He checks his watch against a schedule that is not printed anywhere because it exists only in the speed of men who have decided that time will be bullied. Then he goes back to counting holes. The harbor answers him with the sound a ship makes when it decides to rise. February 12, 1942. Battleship Row, 0635 hours. The harbor wears a wintry gray that makes paint look honest. USS Nevada, BB-36, rocks gently, mud streaming from her bilges in rust-red fans where pumps have at last beaten the seep. She's still scarred. Bomb pocks along her decks, plating creased like a boxer's eyebrow. But the big truth announces itself in small ways. Waterline scum drying on steel, mooring lines taking a cleaner strain, a bosun with a smile he hasn't owned since December. "Make her breathe," someone says over the headsets, and the pumps answer like brass lungs. At 6:40, the mooring buoy creaks, the mud lets go with the sound of a fist opening, and Nevada lifts. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just a steady refusal to stay down. Whistles trill across the yard. A deckhand slaps the life out of a coffee cup on his cap, and a chief grins. They have a ship. Getting to this morning took everything the yard could name. Divers followed Wallen's whole maps frame by frame and dogged on standard patches, their chain tackles creaking under the first suction. Carpenters built and rebuilt cofferdams like custom clothing. Plate shop men rolled curved steel to snuggle along tortured hull seams. Inside Nevada's compartments, salvage crews worked by lantern to shore bulkheads, chase leaks with chalk marks that turned to fingerprints, and rig portable submersible pumps so they could move water like a general moves ammunition. Twice the sea took back an hour's work. Once it took back a day. The men learned to sleep sitting up and to wake to the slap of a wrench on a ladder. There were shocks along the way, the kind that make a yard go quiet. In one compartment, the crew opened a hatch and met a cloud of fuel vapors so thick you could chew it. The hospitalman's ampule snapped beneath a sailor's nose and the deck caught his knees. Another day, a moored barge drifted in a gust and bumped a cofferdam, opening a seam that took 2 diving crews and 3 hours to tame. But the line held, and now lines tend forward. Tugs breathe against the big ship's hip. She comes free and takes a tow, a grand old lady with her hem still heavy. 6 days later, she slides into dry dock number 2, and the iron city around her, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, takes a long, pleased breath. Temporary repairs will make her seaworthy. Puget Sound will remake her for war. New 5-inch to 38 dual-purpose batteries, new directors, a new silhouette. The men on the quay whisper timelines like superstition. October, maybe, back by fall, and the ledger will make it true. If Nevada's rise is the yard's first great proof, it's also a rehearsal for harder cases. Salvors now trust the method. Seal, pump, lift, dock. But every hull makes its own jokes. On California, the list is meaner. The mud is richer. On West Virginia, the torpedo gashes are long enough to be called doorways. And the interior is a geography no one would choose. Heavy oil over brackish water over silt, with air in poisonous pockets that can fell a man in a breath. Wallen builds specialized teams. Divers who do nothing but patch edges in the blind. Riggers who live with chain falls. Gas teams that meter H2S and teach men to clip respirators to their belts the way they once clipped Liberty cards. He assigns a lieutenant with the mind of a millwright to pumping plans. Valves, manifolds, footings for pump skids so the weight won't knock out a deck beam when everything starts to vibrate. Salvage is engineering under grief. As compartments dry, recovery details move in with canvas bags and quiet voices. Someone brings out a sealed locker with a dry calendar inside and a penciled mark that stops days after the raid. The men do their work, and the chaplain does his. On the quay, the yard band plays on Sundays, the only thing anyone will admit to calling a luxury. And from the dry dock catwalk, you can hear brass where once you heard only rivet hammers and oaths. It sounds like a city learning to be more than angry. Before Nevada shifts to the dock, a thin officer in an older uniform, a reservist boosted to responsibility by fire, stands at her bow and reads off the chalked repairs like a litany. Patch C2 holding. Patch F6, chain on dog 3 tightened. Port bilge pump number 2 moved to frame 112. Forward cofferdam dogged and caulked. He looks like a bookkeeper. He works like a stevedore. That's the yard's secret. They keep books with one hand and ships with the other. And when the dock blocks take weight and the water roars away, you can see the teeth marks the torpedoes left. Honest and terrible. Men lean over the rail, hands on hips, and set their jaws. This is fixable. It is not piety. It is math with hammers. Wallen watches without smiling. He gestures to an aide. "Get me the Puget Sound schedule," he says. "She'll need the yard before fall, and I'm not interested in missing Alaska in the spring." It sounds like a boast. It is really a deadline. When Nevada steams out later in 1942 with new guns and a new hunger, the men who made it possible will be here, piecing California and West Virginia back into ships and listening for the sound a battleship makes when the Pacific takes her weight again. Impossible is for people who do not own pumps. March 25, 1942. Beside the sunken hull of USS California, 07's 10 hours. The cofferdam looks ungainly. curving timbers faced with steel plate, studded with dogs and lag bolts. But underwater it sits like a collar that teaches a wounded giant to keep her head above water. Pumps cough. The water inside California sinks inch by inch, revealing decks that have not tasted air since the morning that ripped the harbor open. Bits of a ship's life appear, a mug still tucked by a gauge, a bent ladder, a stack of mess trays like a tiny skyline. Divers surface with grease pencil sketches of ruptures along the torpedo scars. Ship fitters read these wet hieroglyphs and cut plate to fit. In the pumping plan, arrows blossom next to pumps rigged on skid beams, portable 6-inchers, 2500 GPM each, feeding a manifold that gurgles like a patient with good lungs. By afternoon, water slops at boot tops in compartments that yesterday were black lakes. Men mutter to themselves and work faster. California is rising. Then 5 minutes of ordinary turns into a day that men will remember in the smell before they remember in the sound. April 5th, 1942, 13 and 15 hours. A thump ripples through steel, muffled, mean. Not a depth charge, not a hammer. A blast of fuel vapor and hydrogen sulfide snakes along the passageways, shoving men to their knees. Water jets through a seam where a patch slips under shock. The ship's lungs fill again. Evacuate! Evacuate! The call ricochets. Salvors slump on the quay, coughing up oil taste, as the water climbs where it had no right to be anymore. When the pumps find their stride again, it's not bravado that drags the hoses back inside. It's practice. They repatch. They recaulk. 3 nights later, California eases into dry dock number 2. A battered lesson in what happens when chemistry gets a vote. On the dockhead, a chief shakes his head and lights a cigarette with hands that still tremble. Gas is worse than shells, he says to nobody, and nobody argues. Inside the dock, the battle turns visual. The dock pumps lower the basin until California's hull hangs in the open air, torpedo holes yawning like mouths. Gouges overlap dents. Rivet heads are scabbed with hurried weld metal, and the cofferdam, tough as a shoe, shows marks where it wrestled the sea. Plate shop crews trace the wounds with chalk like surgeons planning stitches. They burn out deformed strakes, fit patches that match curvature and rivet pitch, and add stools for temporary pumps where someone might need them again. Electricians snake new cable runs and bring up emergency power buses. Machinery repairmen open reduction gear inspection, covers and drain bronze-colored oil out of bearings that did not drown. A diver's notebook, kept dry with wax paper, goes to the drafting room where a kid with a sleeve garter turns the wet sketches into clean frame-by-frame drawings. The drafting room smells faintly of coffee. The ship smells like a foundry that also remembers being a bog. Loss is present but not resident. Salvage parties recover effects with the quiet that news requires. The chaplain learns the inside of the dry dock as well as any engineer, and men stop him like they're touching wood. The band plays on Sunday because the men asked for it, not because anyone is trying to prove a point. And always, pumps, on deck, in shafts, along bilge keels, thump like a heart with something to do. By June, California has the look of a ship that will move under her own will again. On October 10th, 1942, she sails for Puget Sound, slowly, with an escort, patched but seaworthy, bound for a rebuild that will change her profile and her punch. New anti-aircraft batteries, radar, improved compartmentation. It's not a victory lap. It's a handoff. The yard salutes with the same tired joy they gave Nevada, then pulls their gloves back on and turns as one toward West Virginia. WWII, the worst hurt of the upright battleships, and a test of whether the method scales from hard to hardest. If California gave a lesson in gas, West Virginia will give a lesson in patience. Her torpedo wounds run long under the armor belt. Her internal compartments are layered soups of oil and water and ruined stores. But she is stable and upright, And stability buys time. Time to fit bigger patches, time to rig more pumps, time to let the numbers work. In May, the yard takes a breath when the tape reads what everyone wanted to dare saying out loud. Floated. On May 17, 1942, West Virginia comes off the bottom. On June 9th, she settles onto the blocks in Dry Dock No. 1, scarred but saved. When she steams away April 30th, 1943, bound for Bremerton, she leaves behind a yard crew that has learned how to build a battleship back from sump to truck and then watch her disappear into the horizon they gave her. Wallen spends what feels like 5 years in 12 months, walking from dock to quay to drafting room to the little plywood office where the schedules hang in rows. His signature is on too many work orders to count. His coffee is always cold. If you catch him after midnight with a moment to breathe, he will admit a private heresy. He loves this. Not the reason for it, God no, but the work that takes grief and makes it obey. Years later, he will write a book about it, because the country needs to know what a yard can do when it decides that impossible is just a signal that the pump is undersized. For now, he just flips a page and asks when the next ship can clear the dock. April 30, 1943. Off the Pearl Harbor entrance buoy, 15:10 hours. A tug gives a last helpful shoulder and drops the hawser. USS West Virginia, BB-48, gathers herself like an athlete who has relearned how to run on rebuilt legs. She points her slab bow at the blue lane to Bremerton and puts the smells of the yard, hot flake, wet hemp, cut plate, astern. On the catwalk of Dry Dock No. 1, a scatter of men who have earned the right to stand with their hands on their hips and say nothing at all watch her stern lantern blink. Not funeral, not christening, continuation. In Puget Sound, she will trade weight for wisdom. New dual-purpose 5-inch .38s, modern directors, radars that see at night, and compartmentation that will not be fooled twice. She will keep her name and her bell, and the dents no one could see fit to hammer fair. She will also keep the memory of the men who pulled her foot by foot back into a world that had learned to need her again. The books that matter now are not just in the yard. In Tokyo, staff planners had penciled a subtraction after December. The U.S. battle line broken, the clock on industrial replacement measured in years. Instead, by the time 1943 is old enough to shave, Nevada is firing in the Aleutians. California and West Virginia are thundering through Bremerton's fit-out lists. And ships that looked like photographs of the end have become the beginning of a new amphibious century. The surprise is not mystical. It is valves, patches, pumps, and labor, military and civilian, operating on a schedule that didn't exist on paper, but lived in the parts of men that have decided to be useful. When historians later tally why the Pacific turned, they will write about carriers and code and pilots. They should also write about cofferdams. By autumn 1944, West Virginia is back where war keeps its appointments. In the night river off Surigao Strait, she stands in a line of old battleships that survived the first day of the war and came to collect the last word of one chapter. Crossing the T. Her radar plots spin like sewing machines. Her guns speak in syllables of powder and steel. The men at her plotting tables are too young to have seen Battleship Row burn with their own eyes. They only know the stories, the patches, the way the welding seams look when the sun hits them. On a bridge 1,000 yards away, an officer who keeps the yard close in his head thinks of catwalk smells and the knock of a submersible pump when it hiccups air. He sees in his mind the chalk that wrote, "Floated, 17 May 42," and smiles without shame that the word float could mean fury. What was impossible about Pearl Harbor's resurrection was never the physics. It was the time. Wallen and his crews had to shrink years into months to make a yard into a species of army that could attack problems as if the enemy were a tide with a timetable. They built a doctrine of salvage on the fly, standardized patches, prefabricate cofferdam segments, build pumping trees that could be rigged in hours instead of days, rotate divers so no one went too deep into the dark and forgot the way back. They learned the chemistry the hard way. Hydrogen sulfide and fuel vapor are aristocrats that bow to no one. And they built gas teams who carried meters like chaplains carry books. They invented record-keeping that let a lieutenant at frame 112 talk across the yard to a planner at a desk and mean the same thing by C2 Patch Dog 3. None of this was heroic in the movie sense. All of it was heroic in the way bridges are, by standing. You can still see the photographs. Nevada easing into dry dock number 2 in February 1942. Mud peeling from her plates. California in April 1942. Patched and stubborn after gas tried to take her twice. West Virginia sliding past Hospital Point in April 1943. Gray and purposeful. What you cannot see is the tempo, the way the yard taught itself to drum the hours. On a Sunday, a chaplain says a short prayer on a flatbed as engines idle. On Monday, a boy from Iowa learns to set oakum so tight in a seam that a river changes its mind. On Tuesday, a diver reaches into muck and finds a bolt by feel that he could not have found with his eyes if the water were glass. The schedule eats pages and then eats the pages after that. We will admire later, Wallen had said. And the Navy kept the promise. In 1968, he wrote the book that pulled the story into a single spine. Pearl Harbor. Why, How, Fleet Salvage, and Final Appraisal. A title without adjectives, because he had used up his supply of adjectives on steel. You can read in it the spare verdicts of a practical mind and the numbers that prove that the Pacific Fleet's resurrection was not a miracle from nowhere. It was what happens when a nation tells a harbor to stand up and the harbor decides to obey. And the shock of that decision traveled across 9 time zones and a war.